Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 37. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware that Microsoft will have just had their Build conference, which is an annual developer conference which normally comes with a whole host of exciting announcements. Now, with me being an avid podcast listener, each year I long for a podcast episode to come out straight after Build, overviewing all of the main announcements. Hopefully this year, this podcast episode can do just that. But one problem is that I don't know what the announcements are going to be, because at the time of recording, Build hasn't yet happened. But to help me out on that front, I am very excited to be joined by both Scott Hunter and Gareth Sate, who do know what the announcements are going to be. So welcome, Scott and Gareth. Thank you for joining me to the show.
Hey, thank you, Dan, for having us over.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm always excited to do these podcasts right around Build. Always so many fun announcements and cool stuff that's going to come out.
Yeah, definitely. And you both must be so busy in the lead up to Build, so I am so grateful that you've spared the time to come on the show. So could you both introduce yourselves to the listeners and tell us what you do for both Microsoft, but also for the Build conference?
Yeah, so I'm Scott Hunter, and I am the VP Director of Azure Developer Experience. And so I work on a team that builds a lot of our Azure PaaS services. Our team also builds a lot of the developer tools for Azure across Visual Studio Code, and the CLI. And we build a variety of services as well outside of PaaS. PaaS is Azure App Service, Azure Functions, Azure Container Apps, Logic Apps. But we have lots of other services like the Redis Cache and Config Service and a bunch of stuff like that. And so our job is to make it so any developer can use Azure in any language. And I've also spent a ton of my career at Microsoft working on .NET. First in the ASP.NET team, and then later, back in DevDiv working on .NET Core 1, all the way through .NET 6.
Yeah, and my name is Gaurav Sate. I'm the Director of Product on the Developer Platform and Languages team here at Microsoft. There are three big things that the team is responsible for. First and foremost, it's the .NET platform and the framework. It comes along with its set of languages, be it C#, F#, or VB. The next piece is C++, and the third one being Java. So, that's the place where I work in, or the technology set that I work with. And, I end up working across multiple, teams across Microsoft, whether it is about, the tooling support that we offer for, these developer framework and languages, or whether it's about, building those cohesive end-to-end experience that are cloud first, cloud native first. So I work very closely with Scott's team across that as well.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of both, as the listeners will know, both .NET and Azure. So yeah, all of this stuff is amazing. So I'm really looking forward to digging in. So before we dig into Build, I'm just going to quickly do this episode's listener mention. And this one goes to Steve Collins, who tweeted, "Great last talk of the day at NDC London from Nick Chapsas about minimal API. If you get the chance, also listen to him talk to Dan on the Unhandled Exception podcast." So thank you for the mention, Steve. I really enjoyed recording that one. It was such a fun conversation. And if anyone wants to get mentioned on the show, just send a tweet using hashtag unhandledexception. All feedback is greatly appreciated. And I'm Dracan on Twitter, which is DRACAN. So in the intro, I very briefly mentioned what Build was. But before we dig into maybe some of the announcements, could we talk a little bit more about what Build is and the aims and goals of the Build conference?
Build traditionally has been a conference for developers. So, Microsoft has a couple of conferences during the year. I think of the Build conference being the developer conference. There's the Ignite conference in the fall or in the October-November timeframe. And that's typically for, IT professionals and more than developers. And so for us, for Gaurav and I think the way we think of Build is, we have a couple of places to announce the services and the products that we're working on and kind of give our customers roadmaps and ideas of what to expect from our technologies in the coming months and stuff like that. And so, I hope that any developer that watches Build this year, listens to this podcast, comes away going, hey, I can see what cool enhancements are coming to .NET and where the roadmap for .NET is heading, where the future investments are going to be. And in the case of some of the Azure tech that we work on, what services are we building in Azure to handle your future compute loads as you're thinking of moving to the cloud?
Do you find that with the .NET Conf being, I think it was November last year, and I think with the new November yearly cycle for the new versions of .NET, do you find that whether .NET Conf may have announcements or a new version of .NET going live, that there's a bit of a conflict with announcements for Build versus announcements for .NET Conf?
No, not really. The way we kind of think of this is like .NET is supporting a modern lifecycle policy, but .NET as a product in itself, sees its major releases typically aligned with November timeframe, and that's when we end up doing .NET Conf. But there are so many other pieces of technology, whether it's our Azure platform. Aspects, whether it is tools, where it's almost following an evergreen model these days. So the team is working on so many things. So it's not that we want to keep all the announcements and do it just at the November timeframe, but as we keep adding more value and keep building new things for our customers and developers, we just look at these as like, hey, moments where we can share what we are building with the larger community, because we are building a lot of these products along with the community. So that's one of the things that we look at. So it's not about just hey, it's are we splitting those things, etc. No, as we keep making progress, just use the moments to announce.
Yeah, it's very cool. There's so much stuff going on. So we haven't actually yet spoken before the recording about what the announcements are going to be. So I'm a bit in the dark about what we're going to cover in this episode. But I kind of feel that with .NET being open source and both .NET and Azure having very early previews, I can probably take an educated guess. So I'm assuming there's going to be quite a lot of MAUI.
Yes, one of the most exciting things that we are announcing at Build this year is the general availability of .NET MAUI or .NET Multi-Platform App UI framework. Now, as we know, there are a lot of desktop and mobile devices in the world. There being more than 1 billion Windows devices and over 4 billion, mobile devices. Regardless of whether somebody is a web developer or a native app developer, you want to reach the most client devices possible with great user experiences in the most efficient way possible. In order to reach all these devices with beautiful app experiences, we built .NET MAUI, and we are making it generally available at Build. Now, .NET MAUI is the most productive way to develop native apps that perform great on any device that runs Android, iOS, macOS, or Windows from a single code base. One of the biggest things for web developers to see in this space is MAUI also brings, web and native together. So, you could use Blazor and MAUI together in a single app to build the best of breed hybrid applications across all of these devices as well.
I think that's one thing I'm quite excited about just MAUI before we talk about Blazor. Just the fact that I believe this is like taking over Xamarin, but then also introducing desktop apps and all this kind of thing. And yeah, just being able to have cross-platform desktop applications, because most of my work is like web APIs and like web apps, that kind of thing. But I've dabbled a bit with Xamarin and I've played a little bit with MAUI, and just being able to reuse the same skill set to do desktop apps, where in the past I've used WPF and WinForms and things, but to do cross-platform desktop apps, but also easily make those mobile apps at the same time, that is very appealing.
Yeah, no, that is correct. And, .NET MAUI is really built on .NET 6. So what that means is you get a single unified .NET experience across your workloads and project types, right? There is one base class library and unified type system with CLI support, that one could utilize. And under the hood, if you kind of think about .NET MAUI uses technologies that are, out there today for building native apps on Windows with WinUI, Mac Catalyst for Mac OS, and of course, on iOS and Android. Now, the good thing is .NET MAUI essentially abstracts all these frameworks, into a single framework that is built on top of .NET 6, And as we were talking about, .NET MAUI lets web developers build hybrid web apps as well. So, you can share Blazor web components directly with .NET MAUI apps while having access to, native device capabilities as well as packaging. And by using .NET MAUI and Blazor together, developers can reuse one set of web UI components across mobile, desktop, and web. I think that is pretty powerful.
I want to double in and go, I'm also excited that there's a single project now too. So it's like you take one of our new modern CS project files And all your assets, whether they're your icons or your splash pages when you launch, all of that stuff in a single project is super exciting to me as somebody that when I first played with Xamarin in the past, I remember being confused by, wow, there's an iOS app, there's an Android app, and then there's a class library where you kind of share the stuff between them. As a developer, I feel just more naturally infused by having all the stuff in one single place. I think it just really, really enhances the experience for building these mobile apps. Or I'm not sure they're mobile apps, they're cross-device apps.
Yeah, and I think apart from that single project that you could use, the one other amazing thing that Maui brings to the table, or value prop that it brings to the table, is that, APIs are available directly from C# to access over 60, device platform capabilities across, variety of these devices, whether it's isolated storage, sensors, geolock, so on and so forth. So it's all about, the ease of getting started, having a, single project, and the choice for developers, whether you want to build true native apps, a mix of web and native with hybrid apps, etc.
We've spoken about using Blazor in Maui, but natively it's still XAML if you're not using Blazor, I believe. Is there scenarios where you would choose one over the other? Is it literally just if your team has Blazor skill sets and doesn't want to learn XAML? Or what would help you choose?
I'll give you my example of this. There was a customer that we dealt with last year, and they had a VB6 application, and they were going to move their VB6 application to, they knew they needed to get off of that tech. That was, that's deprecated tech. And as they thought about rebuilding it, they were going to rebuild it with web because, it works on mobile devices, it works everywhere. But the problem was they needed access to native capabilities. So for example, in their business, it was for stores. And so they needed the app to be able to talk to displays on the wall. They needed the app to be able to talk to a cash register. They needed the app to be able to talk to a control system inside of the building as well. And they could have probably gone and wired a bunch of IoT stuff to all that stuff. But the easier way of doing that was actually, if it actually runs as a native app, it has access to all the ports and cables and stuff that are plugged into the computer. And so that's one of the reasons you might build a hybrid application, is because you're not just doing web, but you actually still want access to those native capabilities of a platform. Like if you run an iOS device and you're running a web page inside of that, JavaScript will give you access to some capabilities of the device, but a Maui hybrid app will give you access to the whole device. And so to me, that's one of those decision factors you're making. Obviously, web is ubiquitous. It's easy to find web developers. So you might want to build the UI with the web because that's easy. You might still want those native capabilities, and that's why we would wrap it in a hybrid app.
Can you put, as well as Blazor components, can you put other things within Maui? So I don't know whether I'm misremembering this, but I seem to remember hearing things like being able to put WinForms stuff in there or web forms. Am I misremembering that?
The only web form stuff we did is Jeff Fritz on the team has a series of Blazor components that mimic some of the web form components. So we can find a link to that and add that to the podcast. But the intent there was, another cool part about Blazor is if you're a web form developer, you're probably used to this control model with events that fire off the control model. There's nothing that maps to that in ASP.NET Core better than Blazor does. And so if you're a web form developer and you're looking to, move to the newer tech, then Blazor is kind of a natural feel. It feels very similar to web forms in the .NET framework. And so Jeff Fritz has these cool tools that take about 15 or 20 of the common controls that you would have in web forms and makes them available in Blazor.
Nice. I've got to say, I am a huge fan of Blazor. I'm using it for quite a big project at the moment, and it's just so productive. I think I love the component model of it, so everything's very reusable. And so I've spoken a few times about Blazor in this podcast, and for me, I feel like the Blazor WASM versus Blazor Server, please correct me if I've got this wrong, that I would tend to do Blazor WASM for public-facing applications, but then Blazor Server for internal apps where it doesn't matter if you lose that persistent connection. Is that what you would recommend?
Why do you think that? We'd be curious why you think that public-facing things should be Blazor WASM.
I guess it's because a public website, if someone's maybe traveling on a train or something, maybe they're dropping it in and out of connection, they might lose that persistent connection that's required over the Signal R connection. but maybe that's less of an issue than I kind of assume. I also guess it depends how busy the app is, but because the state is stored on the server side and the DOM's managed on the server side, whether I kind of wonder how scalable that is. I believe it's quite scalable, but I guess less so than a WASM app.
As a long-term web developer, I find that most of our customers tend to want to lean towards Blazor WASM, but I think it's more because it's cool than it's the right solution for the thing. I mean, if you're on a train and you have spotty web, then the web's not going to work that well for you anyways. So I don't think about the size of the connection. I was going to say something even different. The cool thing about Blazor Server is there is no lighter weight SPA framework out there than Blazor Server. If you're building an Angular, React, or a Vue application, you're bringing a chunk of JavaScript down to the client. In the case of a Blazor Server app, we're only bringing down like 100K of JavaScript. It's just enough JavaScript to keep the SignalR connection open and process the messages that come out of that. So the other cool thing about Blazor Server to me is you have all of .NET available to you. Because you're running all of .NET on the server, you can open up a database, you can use a Redis cache, you can do a variety of things because the entire platform is available to you. As soon as you decide to go into a WASM-based application, you're running in the sandbox inside of the browser. And so you lose access to a bunch of those capabilities that you would normally not have. I tend to think that the best use cases for like a Blazor WASM application are, I need a web application that needs to be disconnected, or I need an application that wants to write natively to the screen. If you really want to do high performance drawing and stuff like that, then that's going to be a better story for you because you are running in the browser versus rendering HTML from the back. But really, it's those disconnected, kind of feel like a real app kind of models where I think it fits more. But I do think we all kind of geek out. Even I geek out. I was talking to some people this morning and showing some of the cool stuff where you can run SQLite. There's a flavor of SQLite that now runs in WASM. And I will be honest with you, I geek out and I'm like, wow, that's amazing. I don't know if it's what I should do, but I geek out.
It definitely gets you that portability as well, right? That you are trying to achieve.
Yeah, you can never have too much geeking out anyway. It's all good. One thing I do like about the Blazor server side then is from the productivity aspect. So as you mentioned, you've got access to all .NET and Entity Framework. You can access your database straight away. Where I guess in Blazor WASM, it is a SPA app and you've got to treat it like Angular, Vue, React. And server side, you need APIs. So then you've got to deal with authentication and all this kind of stuff. But with Blazor Server, you can just, your code can talk straight to the database, have connection strings, use configuration. So from a productivity point of view, I don't think you can beat Blazor Server.
Yeah, you call it productivity, but I think just to add on what Scott was saying, I think it's really about what you are trying to build, right? I think if it is a single page app, pretty well contained, the WASM model might work well for you. But if you really want to utilize all the power of .NET, have those different, like whether it is database access or any other thing that you want to run, like, one of the things I was talking to somebody recently is like, hey, I want to run some AI models on the back end. Can I access it with, yes, you will have the power to access them on the server side and, bring down any of that content to render into the web client as well.
So Blazor is already live and you can use it in production and everything. Are there any Blazor-related announcements coming as part of Build?
I think the biggest aspect for Blazor that we are announcing at Build is really that, we are bringing Blazor forward into Maui apps as well to enable those capabilities. That's, I think, the biggest one coming for Blazor. But yes, in general, again, in terms of the enhancements, we keep looking at multiple things that are evolving in the WASM space. There is .NET on WASI, which is like, this is an experimental thing that we've been working on, is like, WASI is a standard for running WebAssembly on the server. And the question that we had was like, can we extend .NET browser-based to a WASM tech to run on WASI? So one of the experiments that we ran recently was, can we run all of ASP.NET Core on WASI? And, we have been able to do that in an experimental form. So which is great. So I think no other big announcements coming for Blazor other than the fact that, yes, Blazor is a tech that, is available with Maui as well.
It's funny, I haven't actually heard of WASI, so I feel I should have done.
Yeah, so WASI is basically, it's essentially a new standard that is, sort of forming, and it's all about running WebAssembly on the server, right? It provides OS-like capabilities, whether it's like things like access to the disk or the network, while keeping the sandboxing, portability as well as the speed of WebAssembly. Some of the use cases here are really things like, whether it's cloud, your edge apps, whether it's IoT and hosting, think about secure multi-tenancy or semi-trusted plugins, etc. It is still, quite early, so it's an unproven technology, but yeah, it's something where we geek out and we feel that it has a potential to be a significant industry-wide shift that it can bring.
Well, that's what happened to Blazor. It was kind of, when it first started, it felt like that kind of new thing that would never, well, not never, but maybe not catch on. And now it's huge. It's kind of, I know lots of companies that are doing Blazor apps. And that's how a lot of these big things start. It starts at something which was just an idea, and then it becomes a huge thing.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And for .NET, we always love to keep playing, love to keep experimenting with the cutting edge, so to make sure that, we can take the .NET developers anywhere where the industry is going forward, right? So some of these are very, very early, but yeah, no, it's exciting for sure.
Yeah, that's what I love about .NET with all the new releases. Like, I'm a big fan of the way C# is becoming much more functional, because I just like having my code like really succinct and small and functional, and it's just becoming easier and easier and easier to do that. Yeah, so like huge fan. With Blazor, I know there's all the AOT stuff. Is that changing in .NET 7? Is that improving? How does that work?
With .NET, there are really three core pillars that we build .NET on. I think the first one is performance, the next one is simplicity, and the third one is ubiquity or being everywhere. And what you touched upon is the first pillar around performance. One of the things that we keep working on with every release of .NET is we want to make it go faster and faster. Of course, in terms of AOT, we are going to be making progress, but even if you look back at the .NET 6 release, we did a blog post where, Stephen Thorpe from the team, like he did a 30 plus page blog post about, how we are improving the performance of .NET. So yes, I think with every release, there are enhancements. We are still continuing to push the boundaries with the AOT support for Blazor as well. So there will be enhancements that are surely coming in the area.
So am I right that when doing AOT, whilst it's increasing the performance, it'll also increase the size that gets downloaded to the browser?
Mm-hmm. That is correct. So, I think one of the things AOT gives you like faster startup, but it comes at the cost of like higher footprint initially, or a, memory footprint initially. It's one of the things that we also keep paying close attention to see like how we could bring the best of both worlds without, bringing a lot of overhead. But yes, for developers, that's a balance that you would have to achieve, because I think while AOT helps provide much faster, startup time, it does come at a cost of like a heavier memory footprint.
And can you combine that with, I'm going to use the term tree shaking, but I believe you use another term. Can you combine that to actually reduce the size a bit?
We're already doing the tree shaking in the Blazor apps already. That's one of the ways that we actually make sure we don't bring like a crazy amount of stuff down. And that tree shaking got better in .NET 6. So if you look at a Blazor WASM app from .NET 5 to .NET 6, you'll see a pretty significant decrease in size. Another aspect, kind of what Gaurav was saying, is I hope that in the future, right now, if you throw the AOT switch on in a Blazor WASM app, we AOT your entire application. I'd love to get to a point where you basically put an attribute or some kind of designator on the code that you want AOT. Because what I really want, I might have some graphics work that I'm painting on the screen, and that's really important for that to go fast. But the rest of it, I don't care. And so, hopefully in maybe 7 or sometime down the line, we give you more controls so you can decide how much code for us to actually AOT versus how much do we interpret in the browser.
That makes total sense. And presumably you've got some form of caching with files being downloaded anyway, so it's not like every time you go to a page, you're downloading all that every single time.
That's just part of PWA. I think the manifest file that is part of a PWA application kind of tells the browser, hey, you should cache this stuff. So you pay the cost once, and this is random, but just talking about size and performance and stuff. One of the things that really excites me about Blazor, and we've had this for a bit, is we do have the ability to pre-render the first version of the page on the server. which is probably one of my favorite Blazor features, because how many of us hit websites? I was hitting a third-party conference website just yesterday, and you hit the web page, and the page is a blank page with a spinning circle in the middle of it. And I know Dan Roth on Gaura's team has done plenty of demos where he basically shows you can build a fairly cool Blazor application, even in WASM, and have those first pages just load up instantaneously. And I know in 6, we actually even take the state from the pre-render, and it's available to the app after the app renders that first page. And so it doesn't have to do any more work on the next request either. And so that's the kind of cool tech I think of when I think of Blazor and performance. And, I as I said, I hate seeing spinning circles or empty web pages. And it seems to be the norm today on the web. You go to all these pages and they just, they load really slow.
Yeah, definitely. Am I right that that's restricted to the hosting model? So if you're putting a Blazor WASM app in some static storage like blob storage, you can't do that in that case. You've got to actually host it, Blazor, in something like ASP.NET Core.
I don't know. I think it still works in static storage as well, because typically the first page of an app doesn't really know who you are, or I think it would once again depend on the app. If the app's doing like, hey, I'm going to render this way if you're in this country or something like that, then maybe you wouldn't be able to use that capability, or you'd have to do some extra work to make the capability work. But most web pages don't know much about you on the first request.
Presumably that would really help with SEO and that kind of thing as well.
It does, yes. Yeah, that's the biggest challenge I think as a web developer. You find if you build a fully modern client app, is if it's all being rendered on the client, then there's nothing for the search engine to look for when it hits the pages.
Yeah, exactly. That's one thing I'm always aware with, like not just Blazor WASM, but whether it's Blazor, Angular, Vue, React, whatever, it's how does this affect SEO?
And we do support the hybrid model as well, where you can actually have regular ASP.NET pages inside of a Blazor app as well. So you can have a mix of the client stuff and a mix of the server stuff as well. Because once again, this is one of my pet peeves is we overdo the client stuff. Just like we were talking about WASM earlier, people, web developers today overdo. There was nothing wrong with server rendered pages. In many cases, they're just as good or better, and you're not really making an improvement to the web experience by trying to run it all in the client. And so I don't know if Gaurav feels this way. I mean, Gaurav, of course, has, I'm going to leak his background. He used to work on the Edge team. So he is a web developer end to end as well. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Gaurav, on what you think about overusing client tech and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think there is thanks there, Scott. Thank you for leaking my background. So yes, I am pretty new into the .NET side and into the area. I've spent many years working on the web and web platform, runtimes, languages, etc. I think it is really a mix, and it is dependent upon the use case that you want to drive. I think, again, as we were saying, when you are on the client, you are pretty much restricted to a sandbox, and you have to make sure that you are delivering a very optimized experience within that sandbox. If you need to have places where there is extremely high level of interactivity, you need to have very rich access. Many a times, I've seen things doing much better in terms of even things like server-side rendering as an example, and then, just streaming it down to the browser. And this is one of those battles that I think in the last 20 years, I have not seen one technology win the battle. It's always each side keeps fighting to see hey, which one is better. And the good thing is for developers and for end users, what it means is we all keep improving in terms of both the technologies and both keep evolving. So I think for developers in general, I would say it really is dependent upon your scenarios. There is no one particular guidance that I've seen is hey, you're doing X, go client, you're doing Y, go server. It's really you need to think about your scenario, how it optimizes, what all dependencies does it have, is it going to be super chatty, etc., and then kind of go from there.
This really reminds me of part of a conversation in the last episode. I had Andrew Locke on the show, and we were talking about ASP.NET Core and Razor Pages, Blazor, and pretty much he's a big fan of server-side stuff. He's got a book on ASP.NET Core where he talks a lot about Razor Pages, and he was saying exactly what you've just been saying about don't forget server-side is still a thing. And as you said, it's kind of WASM is cool and new and shiny, and people like to geek out. So I think the important thing is that developers understand all of the different options and make a knowing decision about what tech they're going to choose, because they're probably going to be stuck with that tech for the next few years for that project.
Yeah, no, and I think the one small little thing that I would add here, as a blurb is it is pretty exciting to be probably the only runtime outside of the JavaScript VMs that supports WASM today, right? I mean, it is exciting, it is cutting edge, we are all in it learning together, and it is evolving, but it is pretty exciting to have a runtime that supports WASM outside of any JavaScript VM. So that is so good. So happy to see that coming from the team.
The listeners can't see, but I can see you're both getting really excited in the webcam. So that shows how the geeking out and the new and shiny is. Oh, it's good fun. That's one thing I just love about this industry. There's so much cool stuff to learn and play with.
Just to add to that, I think part of it is making sure that .NET's ready for whatever the next generation of things that happens in the industry is. And so we want to make sure in .NET that we're always, looking at where the future might be and we're ready for it. You don't want to get surprised and then be 2 or 3 years behind. That was one of the original inspirations of doing some of the WASM stuff. And there's other things too, like, .NET 6 shipped with a preview of HTTP 3, which also will show that, the .NET is staying on the bleeding edge, even though HTTP 3 is not ready yet. It's, that when it is ready, .NET's going to be there right away because we already have a preview implementation of it running today. And that's kind of how I think in .NET we're always trying to stay right on the edge so you get the new capabilities right when they come out.
And presumably that'll tie quite well into stuff that's been done in Azure too.
That's actually a challenging thing. I mean, there's been, one of the features that we have in .NET is gRPC. And you'll find there's plenty of parts of Azure where gRPC doesn't work the way that you would want. I don't mind sharing the technical reasons for that. It's some of the front end tech in Azure is running older operating systems that don't support those new standards. One of the cool things that Gaurav's team is doing is they actually built a tech called YARP, yet another reverse proxy. And the cool thing about YARP is, Azure's a big beast, and some of the machines are going to be on Windows, some are going to be on Linux. And it's not easy just to go swap something to something else. And so you can't do that. But the cool thing about YARP is it runs both on Windows and Linux. And so if you're just Linux only, Nginx might be a great proxy for the front of a web app. But because of Azure, and there's cases where we have to run on both of those, Nginx is not a great fit. But YARP is a great fit because it runs both on Windows and Linux. And so no matter where a customer is and where they're heading, you will get all the latest features. And so many of the parts of Azure are now starting to run their front ends on YARP, which means they will have access to all the bleeding features, the latest edge features that we have in .NET. So it means when HTTP 3 is available, anybody running YARP in front of their service in Azure will get HTTP 3, day zero. And you will see that App Service is in the process of actually moving their front ends to the YARP tech. And when that happens, you're going to get all the latest goodies like gRPC available natively in App Service. And that's a big request that we get all the time. There's some hacks people can use today. There's a great package that Gaurav's team builds that lets you run gRPC over web. And it can be a workaround for doing App Service today. But it's kind of cool seeing the parts of Azure use some of our tech to make sure that no matter what OS they're on or what versions of OSs they're on, they can apply the latest capabilities of the web to those services in Azure.
Yeah, that's very cool. I have seen the announcements of YARP. I think there was was it last week where there was a new version of it. I've not played with it yet, but I'm really hoping, because I've used Nginx a bit and the config files are not the best. I'm hoping that moving over to YARP, it should be a bit easier to actually use. But yeah, it's just one of these things on my long list of things to play with.
Speaking of config files, that's a great example of where WebAssembly is an emerging space for WebAssembly is, whether it's Nginx or it's YARP or a variety of other solutions that are out there for many things. In many cases, you have to code the rules for these things in whatever language it was. Maybe it might be JavaScript in some cases. It could be, in the case of YARP, it'd be C#. In the case of Nginx, it's something else. And that's where WebAssembly, this is even outside of .NET. You can ignore .NET. WebAssembly is a cool tech because it means you could use any language. Imagine if your rules are written in WebAssembly, well, then suddenly it's language agnostic and you can write rules in whatever language you feel the most comfortable with. And so that to me is an emerging part of tech all up, where things like WebAssembly, I think the term we use is democratize the way that you do these things. It'd be cool. I'm just making stuff up, but imagine if YARP supported rules in WebAssembly and you could write rules in C++ for your YARP proxy. I mean, we have the right tech to do this kind of stuff. I don't know if it's worth the investment, but it's, if the market wanted to go those places, we have the tech to do it.
Yeah, so WebAssembly is the new assembly. So we mentioned Hot Reload briefly earlier, and I know that's already out there, but I've certainly found instances where it's not reloaded when I would expect it to. And I believe the new versions of .NET are actually improving on that. Is that something we've got to wait till .NET 7, or is that something that's coming sooner?
Yeah, I think in terms of the hot reload, right, there are a bunch of scenarios that we are aware that, weren't working fully with .NET 6. But again, the goal was to make sure whatever we have, we bring the value add to the developers as soon as we can. There are surely areas that we are continuing to improve upon there. In terms of the support and how we can, keep bringing more support across scenarios with, of course, with the Maui release, with .NET 7, etc. So you'll keep seeing the support improving across those scenarios as we keep progressing along.
Yeah, it's definitely just having that shortened developer loop. So I can tend to have like my IDE on one screen and the browser on the other, and just being able to change code, and as I'm changing it, I'm seeing it update straight away. Now, if I think back to when I used to develop on web forms, for example, and I make a change, and you'd have to wait like a minute or something. I know this had like when I did it, I tended to have a CMS on top of it, so that might have even slowed it down even more. But just having to wait a couple of minutes for every single change for productivity, that's just an absolute killer. And the difference, Hot Reload, where you just get that immediate feedback, night and day.
Yeah, and then, I think then the thing I was about to say is like, when you were talking about this, we saw that, happiness on your face, because, that productivity win, that faster iterative loop for any developer is such a critical thing to, keep improving on. Because that's one of the things, like, if you quickly start adding up all the time that you're spending in building and relaunching and trying to see what changes you made have actually helped the app in the right way or not, that is a big productivity win when you start adding up all those minutes and hours that developers spend on those sort of activities on a day-to-day basis. So yes, +1, like love the productivity gains that it is bringing.
Speaking of happiness on my face, a lot of the listeners will know that I'm a huge fan of Kubernetes. And I think you've already spoken about it before, but there's a new thing in Azure called Azure Container Apps, which I must confess, I use AKS quite a lot in Azure, and I haven't played with Azure Container Apps yet, which is unlike me because it's built on Kubernetes, so I should have played with it by now, but I haven't yet. Can we talk a bit about Azure Container Apps?
Sure. Azure Container Apps is something that we GA'd at Build, and so it's now generally available to anybody that wants to use. It was in preview before. And the intent of Container Apps is pretty simple. First off, I think we all know that, at least I feel this way right now, we're in a mode where container feels like the publish kind of asset that we do. It used to be in the past, you might publish your source code or you might publish the actual components of your application. And now most of us are publishing containers to the cloud. And the idea behind Container Apps is, first off, we all know that Kubernetes is super cool. What makes Kubernetes awesome is it's kind of cloud and company neutral, which means it doesn't bring a bias with it for the most part. But as somebody whose team builds all of our PaaS platforms, Azure Functions, Azure App Service, we also know there's plenty of people that want to run containers and want to run on Kubernetes, but don't want to manage the Kubernetes. And so think of Azure Container Apps as a way of running your containers on top of Kubernetes, but we're managing the Kubernetes cluster for you under the cover. You still get all the scalability features you might want, so you can actually scale it up and scale it down like you want. It's got support for multiple versions and revisions of the applications. It's got a ton of great features inside of it. And it addresses a couple things that our current PaaS platform doesn't address really well. So if you have an Azure App Service and you have an Azure Function, well, those are two different Azure resources, and each of them is going to be on their own network. And if you want to put them on the same network, well, you have to go to premium SKUs. You have to create a virtual network, a lot more work for you. One of the cool things about Azure Container Apps is, we're running it in a Kubernetes cluster for you. And, you can run 3 or 4 containers in there, as many as you want, actually. And they're all on the same network without you having to create a VNet or pay for premium versions of SKUs and stuff like that. And so we're super excited of just saying, if you want to manage Kubernetes, then run AKS. If you want to run containers and not have to manage the Kubernetes, then you can run Azure Container Apps. And we run into customers that are on both ends of those spectrums. And some would be in both products. And one of the things that we want to do as a team is today it feels like you have to choose door A or door B. If you want to use App Service or say AKS, well, once you go down either of those paths, it's not very easy to go in the other door. One of our goals with Azure Container Apps is we want to make it very simple to say, hey, do you have a container in Kubernetes AKS that you want to just move into Container Apps? Yeah, you can do that. Do you have a container in Container Apps? You want to move it to AKS? So we want to make it feel like you've not made a binary decision. When you make a decision and you can say, hey, this part's of my apps, I don't need to really manage them a whole bunch. So I'm going to run them in Azure Container Apps. This part of the app, I want to manage all of it myself, and I want to have my ops team drive that. So we want to give you all those flexibilities, and that's our goal. Is not to give is to give you a great spectrum of choice and control. All the way from App Service if you want us to manage the runtime and manage the operating system. Azure Container Apps gives you containers on top of Kubernetes without managing Kubernetes, and then AKS gives you full management, full control of everything. And I think it makes our cloud a great cloud, giving you that full sway back and forth of control that you want.
Yeah, I guess even with AKS, because the node pools, so VMs are created by Azure, they're still a managed instance. So it's not like you're doing a completely managed cluster, because I wouldn't recommend anyone nowadays, unless it had to be even on-premise, there's managed options. But to create an AKS cluster, it's really easy to do. And you've got to do more for yourself, you've got to understand more, but it's still managed by Microsoft, which is quite nice. So if you're using Azure Container Apps, which again I've not actually played with yet, can you still run things? So if you're using Helm, for example, can you still run Helm commands against it, or do you have to do it in a certain way for Azure Container Apps?
You can't run Helm commands against it today. You can't use like kubectl against it today. That is an area that we still are exploring. Like for example, one of the things we could do in Azure Container Apps is we could decide to have a button that you press. And when you press the button, it exposes the actual underlying Kubernetes cluster, and you could do whatever you want there. I think that's a one-way switch, though. Once we give that to you, you could do actions that would cause our self-management not to work correctly. And so we've not figured out the nuances of how to do that, but we definitely are thinking about those types of things. Today, the things that you would do with those tools are primarily available either via the Azure CLI or via the portal if you want to go and click buttons and drag sliders and stuff like that. But we're definitely going to explore those areas, once again based on customer feedback.
Yeah, I guess it's a difficult one. If you allow switching to access Kubernetes and change Kubernetes stuff and then switch back, then how does that affect SLAs and things? Because you don't know what the customer might do.
Exactly. And that's why we think it's a one-way switch. If you switch that direction, I don't think we could at least do a diff and see if you haven't changed anything. But if you've gone and tweaked on stuff, then I can't promise that we can actually manage things for you, after that change. And as I said, there's plenty of customers that, want full Kubernetes experience, and there's plenty of customers that just want to run containers in the cloud as seamlessly as possible. And we want to offer the full spectrum there. There's no competition between the services. They're built on top of each other. So it's.
So if this is easy to throw containers into the cloud, what does that mean for Azure Container Instances?
So, ACI is always a funny thing. So for folks that don't know it, ACI is like, I would say it's a building block. In fact, when you run a container in Azure Container Apps, the actual container is running in ACI. ACI, in many cases, is a building block for many of the services that we build. And it's a case of us, a customer asked me this just yesterday, was asking me, hey, what's the difference between container apps and container instances? And I'm like, well, in a container instance, nobody's monitoring your health. In a container instance, nobody's helping you scale it up and scale it down. You've lost all that management. It's an unmanaged way of running containers. And so you've got to build your own tools and your own stuff around it to get whatever kind of capabilities you want. And so the big drive for Azure Containers Apps is we're doing all the management for you. And another cool feature of Container Apps is we also do support scale to zero. So if you have parts of your app and you want to scale them down and save money, the tech will do that all the way down. You probably get a 4 to 5 second startup cost on the next time you get a request. but there could be parts of your apps that don't need to be 100% available all the time. And so, that's a great feature as well. But I think of container instances as, I'm surprised that there's many customers running them because they are completely raw and managed. But I'm not surprised. As I said, a lot of our internal services end up being us running our own management planes that are managing some ACIs under the cover.
So I'm just thinking about some of the things that I might manually install into an AKS cluster. And I'm thinking about things like pod identity. There's an add-on which you can do managed identity per pod. You might want to install a service mesh like Open Service Mesh or Linkerd or something like that. You might want dashboarding so you can actually visualize and see what's going on within your cluster. Does Azure Container Ops give you this stuff out of the box?
It won't give you all that stuff out of the box today, but over time, we will bring those types of capabilities to you. So if you look at App Service has a ton of amazing capabilities. One of my favorite features in App Service is if you want to go have your application, and this is used by tons of internal Microsoft teams, I'm going to build a website for Gaurav, and it's going to help his team manage some part of .NET. But we don't want that website to be open to the public. If I go into an app service, I can click a few buttons and decide to put that whole thing behind AAD. And the developer didn't have to write any code. The developer didn't have to learn about AAD. And so what I hope we will do is go look at the services that AKS has and the capabilities that App Service has, and find a mesh of those that will then layer on top of container apps to give you a bunch of self-serve capabilities. So while you could construct those manually in say AKS, we're going to provide more of the PaaS kind of experience. So it's like, check a few boxes, boom, and you've got something going like that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. It feels like we're just moving to a world where you're always using something like Kubernetes, but you just don't know you're using it.
Exactly. But as I said, if you want to see it, we'll give you the ability to either move to Kubernetes or potentially expose Kubernetes to your cluster. And then, once again, it's all about choice and control. But if you're just building like a couple of functions and a couple of websites, do you need all those controls? Probably not. And us managing for you is probably a better experience. If you're a crazy huge box retailer running at crazy scale, then you probably want more control, and you're going to go and build some of your own management structures on top of that, on top of something like Kubernetes.
Yeah. I really like the point you made before about the fact that with using app service plans, if you want it to be private, then you've got to introduce like VNet integration. You've got a private link for access to database and storage and all that kind of stuff. But whilst it's not that complicated when you know it, and also you mentioned about the different tiers as well, if you don't know it, there's a lot of learning to actually be able to do any of that. So it's kind of, I guess by default, it's less secure. Where with Kubernetes and Azure Container Apps, out of the box, it's private. So the default is private. And then you've got to create something like an ingress and that kind of thing to actually make that publicly accessible. So I like the fact that default is switched and it's secure by default.
Yep. And I find a lot of companies don't even have engineers that this is one of the things that we talk about in .NET all the time is, security and auth are some of the most complicated parts of the web today. And it gets more complicated every year, it feels like. I mean, we're trying to go passwordless now, and there's a whole bunch of efforts from, various big companies trying to do this kind of stuff. And I believe very strongly that we as developers should not be writing that kind of code. We should be relying on a platform to do that stuff for us. I was just talking to Brady Gaster on Gaurav's team last night, oddly enough, about some of the ideas we had in .NET about should AAD be like the default way of securing a .NET application. Most of our customers don't realize that you can have like 25, 30,000 users in AAD for free. So people are like, oh, I don't want to go sign up for I'm going to pay a lot of money or stuff. We did some experiments or we did some analysis maybe half a year ago or a little bit longer, and found out that you can do a whole bunch of stuff for no cost at all. And I'm like, why would you not want to use, we have the best security experts in the world working on that tech, making sure it's secure. There's no way that any of us on this call would have the experience to guarantee our apps the same way. Obviously Microsoft's being attacked every day by various evil parties in the world. And I would just love knowing that my stuff's protected by that tech. And we run that tech at like massive scale.
I think that's it. So a project I'm working on for one of my clients, in fact, it's the Blazor app I mentioned before that we're building. We're actually just starting to use B2C and creating the new Blazor app, .NET new Blazor, I can't remember the things. There was a command line option to integrate into B2C, enter, got a new project, went into Azure Portal, created a new B2C tenant, added the IDs and things into my project in the settings.json, whatever it is, app settings.json, ran it, and it worked. I basically loaded the page, F5, did sign up. It then switched to the B2C login, which I can now theme however I want. Created an account, logged me back, and I was using it in the Blazor app. And that whole process, like creating the B2C tenant, creating the Blazor app in the first place that used it, I did the hosted model. So the Blazor app had, I won't say the server because that's going to confuse it with Blazor server, but it had like a project called server, which was an API effectively, and the Blazor wasn't front end. So that was like within minutes, and I had it up and I could log in, create an account in B2C, and it just worked. Literally minutes.
That's what we offer. I mean, to me, if I think of our entire group, Gaurav and I both work in DevDiv, developer division. We build, obviously the Visual Studio family of tools. We build a ton of languages, whether it's C++, .NET, Java, Python. We build a bunch of Azure services. To me, that's what excites me to be here and work on this tech, is enabling you to go do that complex scenario in just a few command lines and a few clicks, and to have something that's fully secured by some of the best tech in the world. You're just describing, you're making, I assume Gaurav's happy as well. This is hearing a customer say what you said is exactly what our goal was, building all, the cloud pieces, the IDE pieces, and the framework pieces.
Absolutely. And also the tooling pieces there as well, right? So I think just one other example I will throw in here is one of the other trends that has taken off quite a bit over the last few years is this whole API economy, right? Or being API first. And, just like hot reload, one of the things that we saw where, developers run into a lot of troubles is especially when you're using tools and trying to debug your APIs, you are essentially not running locally on your device, and, you're running somewhere else, whether it's a mobile device where you're consuming the API, etc. So it's just like that whole productivity loop seems to be broken, like when you start to debug, a bunch of those things. So with Visual Studio 2022, the upcoming preview release that we are shipping at Build, one of the big features we are previewing is, what we call port tunneling. So basically what port tunneling does is it opens a port on the device and on your local debug machine. So even when you are utilizing, these APIs and you start the debugging process, it just feels as if it is running on your local device. So, again, yes, very happy to hear what you were saying. But again, I also wanted to bring in that little bit of a tools aspect as well, because I think with tooling, even though developers are able to build these cohesive end-to-end, we also want to make sure that developers keep feeling more productive. We kind of keep making it more and more easier and seamless for them to ensure that Visual Studio family of tools brings them the best experience possible.
Yeah, I think because as I mentioned before, a lot of the stuff I do is just .NET and Azure. So me doing development using just on my Windows machine, that's fine. But I think for developers doing just stuff on devices and all that kind of thing, or technology that's not as easy to work with Windows, and now with VS Code, and you've got, I think, is it dev containers and that kind of thing, where you can actually work on another device, work remotely, but it feels like you're working on your machine.
Yeah, one of the other big things that we announced at Build is we previewed the DevBox stuff at Build, and it's really about when you think about teams, we've heard this common problem of it's just hard, and it takes a lot of time for somebody new on the team to get started. So one of the goals that we have with DevBox is, and I think I would love to see if Scott has something to add on to my understanding here. The main premise is hey, we want developers to feel productive in terms of getting started. Hey, you have a box that is provisioned with the right environments, with the right tools for you as quickly as, you can probably go try and make a latte, in the same time. I was reading some tweet about this the other day. It's how quickly can you become productive? right? So, DevBox as a concept essentially enables developers and development teams to not only, create environments that are cloud hosted, but, that gets the developers going, whether you are day one, new to a team, or, you just are shifting projects and you want to move from environment A to environment B. We kind of make it very easy, and over time seamless as well for different, developers.
The DevBox stuff excites me a whole bunch. And here's one of the common scenarios that I see with customers. And we're all aware of this. I mean, if you work at a company, you've probably been developing apps for, 5, 10, 15 years. Some of those apps are old, crufty apps, but they're still useful. That's just reality. I remember visiting a customer one year, and the customer had on their developer machines, they had every version of Visual Studio all the way back to Visual Studio 2010. And I remember me and my colleague that was there with me were like, well, why are you doing this? And it's because some of those apps depended on features that were only in those versions of Visual Studio. Imagine with the DevBox of just saying, hey, for this app, I just go and say, go make me a machine that has VS 2012. Or for this one, make me one that does this. That is such a better experience than having to go and have just a pile of old crufty tools on a box. So I'll go way out on a limb and say I would love a future where, you tell us what you're trying to build and we just give you the right dev box based on what that is. I mean, all of us have probably gone through, hey, I'm going to go and I'm going to go visit a customer and I need to go build a box. So I make sure that my box is ready, that I can go show containers. I need Docker for desktop. I need the newest Visual Studio. I need Node.js. I need Python. I mean, most of us probably have scripts or some kind of thing to go put that together. I look forward to a day when I can just ask for a machine and it goes poof. Imagine when you went and pulled a project from GitHub, if there was a file in that repo that told us what the environment was required to build that application. And, I need to go do some maintenance on this old API. And I just get a box that works. I work on that API for the day, then I put it back. That's the experience I would love to see. We don't have that yet, but I'd love to see DevBox turn into that.
So with these dev boxes, if you're creating your own customized dev box, is there an element of configuration as code so you can source control the changes?
I don't think Gaurav and I both have enough experience in this space yet. We're more experts in .NET and Azure than we are in DevBox at this point. So we're just kind of telling you what I think we would like to see and some of the benefits that we can envision based on our developer experience. But I don't know the nuts and bolts of this stuff.
Fair enough. I know I've certainly worked in companies before where on my first day in the company, I can think of one in particular where I think it took about 2 days to get fully set up to work on the project. And that was I was new to the team, obviously, but that was with the lead developers sat next to me trying to get it to work too. Now that is insane. So 3 people's time for 2 days. And yeah, and I think that's so common, which is scary, really.
In the era of Microsoft that I joined, it was the same way. So we basically had a wiki that you had to go read and run all these steps. And then every morning when you got to work, what you would do is you run a special script. And what it would do is it would build the latest version of Visual Studio on your machine. And the reason we would do that is because obviously we're developers for developers. And so we want to be on the latest tool. And if you want to be able to put breakpoints in ASP.NET, you want to be able to put breakpoints in Visual Studio, you have to run this awful script and it's like, run the script and you have 20, 25 minutes before you actually can be productive. And every morning, just think of all of us running that script time and time again. And all it was doing was going and fetching the latest random tools from the cloud somewhere, the network actually. But we don't do it that way anymore, which is much better. I don't miss any of that stuff.
How much coffee can you drink in that time, in that 25 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I was about to say is I think we've made progress, but I think in terms of the future that we envision, I think there is way more we can go and do. One of the other aspects here with these dev boxes that I can imagine is at some point, if you think about, not only just from a developer perspective, but from an enterprise and IT admin perspective of staying secure, keeping things safe, there is the aspect of manageability that can also come as part of this, right? You have environments that are always up to date, that stay safe, etc. So there's a whole lot we can go do. Again, as Scott was saying, we can only envision at this point in time while not knowing the nuts and bolts. And I'm excited about that technology as we move forward.
a couple of years ago, there was a lot of hype about something called Project Ti, and lately I've not really heard anything about it. Is that died or?
So just for people that are listening for the first time and had never heard about Project Ti, the intent of Project Ti was multi-part apps are just hard. Most of my career, I just wrote an app, and it's not a big deal. I wrote an app. Maybe the app did talk to an API, but I wrote an app. And, as we move into this world where microservices are a much more common form of building an application, where you've got, hey, I might have a front end, I might have 3 back end applications. Running that locally is a challenge. And what we all do is we go into Visual Studio and we create config files for each of the apps, and we go figure out what port the apps are going to boot up on, and we then go to the other app and make the config point to that port. And then you start all the apps together and you get that to run, and then you copy it to the cloud at some point. When you do that, you got to change all those IP addresses and ports again to map to wherever they're going to map in the cloud. What you do today probably is you go and stick environment variables into your cloud, and you have the app pull the environment variable. And that's just a gumble of goop and jumble of goop. So Ti tried to solve those types of problems. Ti said, hey, if you're building multi-part applications, let's go do a bunch of things for you. Number one was making it easy to discover the different components and call them and keep the IP addresses and ports all under control, publish the application to the cloud, and once again, keep all that stuff in control. Running locally, being able to start more than one app, so you don't have to go and have like 3 terminals open and run them all in different terminals, or in Visual Studio, right-click and set startup to start up more than one app, which then makes Visual Studio kind of slow and chunky, and you've got to get the order correct. And so Ti just tries to solve a bunch of those kind of common pain points that we have building those types of apps. We started Ti as a .NET app, but various people inside of Microsoft have got it working for Node applications and Java applications and some Python applications as well. And there's something else we just announced at Build, and we call this the Dev CLI. And this is a CLI based on trying to make you more productive with cloud-based applications. And so it's going to start trying to solve a different problem. But I think the Ti capabilities will be the next step of the Dev CLI that we just announced. And the idea of the Dev CLI is, okay, let's say there's a repo of code in GitHub, and you then want to make that repo run in Azure. Well, what typically you see today is you see in the README of the repo, they'll be like, hey, here's the 35 commands you run from the Azure CLI to make all this stuff work. And please don't mess any of them up or do any of them in the wrong order, because if you do, you're doomed. And so the point of the Dev CLI is it's going to be based on conventions. And so there'll be a folder where we would expect to have all the environment files that contain things like your ports and your IPs and stuff like that we know have to be swapped out as we move into the cloud. It'll contain a folder that contains bicep files. Bicep is the next generation of ARM, the description language for Azure. And the app should have a folder with the right files inside of that. And if the tool sees that structure, it will know how to actually create a version of all of those assets for you so you can run the app locally. And it will know how to create a version of those assets for you so you can run the app in the cloud. This is kind of code to cloud. And code to cloud today might take 30 minutes in many cases, and we want to be able to make it as simple as any Azure sample you could code to cloud in 5 or 6 minutes. And so code to cloud is the first wave of that. The next wave of that will be, well, how do we get it so you can run a multi-part app locally? How do we get it where you can then publish the multi-part app to the cloud? And even more so, I think an area that I don't think I know where the future is. I don't know. I would assume Gaurav doesn't know where the future is. Many of us today, when we build apps, we run all the components on our local machine. But I can't see that being the future. I mean, there's I don't want to really go replicate my whole microservice architecture in my box. And so maybe the next wave of this will be, hey, I just want to work on this one part. Bring the one part down, do all the mappings. So the one part I can run locally and the rest of it runs in the cloud. So this space is, got tremendous opportunities, but hopefully you're going to see a lot of the Ti stuff start coming back as part of the Dev CLI. First, just, publish and run, and then the multi-part stuff maybe later this year.
Nice. So it's not died, it's just going to be renamed and have a lot more other stuff as well. It's quite interesting you mentioned about conventions for folder names and things and having bicep files. I think that's really nice, just having a standard so that if this just becomes in the future the way you run .NET apps in Azure, then a new member of the team joining the team, that's seen that before will recognize your folder conventions. I guess one thing that jumps out though is, so with bicep files, generally where you're deploying air quotes infrastructure, and I suppose with a bigger team where you might have an operations team which want to manage that side of things. So like if you've got bicep files deploying your clusters or app services or databases or Azure storage and stuff, that feels quite an infrastructure thing, where I see quite often in teams where you have the developers would then not be part of that, but they'll be building the apps which deploys on top of that infrastructure.
Yep. That is why we will make it where potentially your ops people could come in and write the files for the conventions for you. So then you as a developer just hooks up and does the right stuff. We're not there at that point. Our current goal, our first goal was, code to cloud. And this is a true story. We had some Python customers on a call, and we tried to get a 2-part application running in Azure. Nobody was actually able to install the prereqs in the 30-minute phone call. And so that's another part of the dev CLIs. It's a single exe. So it literally is, on a Windows PC, you can X-copy the file into your bin folder and you're ready to rumble. But we're just tipping the surface, and this is a start, and we'll learn from it. And that's also why we're not trying to do something grandiose and try to do everything day zero. Let's take a little baby step, see what the reactions are. And the bigger test will be, will bigger enterprises want to actually mimic some of this tech for what they're actually doing for their, development and production as well? And I don't have the answer for that yet. Been a fun part of always being in .NET is seeing the crazy stuff that the way people assemble our stuff. .NET ends up being used in ways that we're like, why did you do it this way? But, as I said, we're just going to take a baby step and see if we can get to this first scenario done, which is, whether you're a Java, .NET, Python, Node developer, you should be able to go clone most of our samples and run them very easily and quickly. But the CLI does have the capability to say there's an init command, which will actually create all the base stuff for you. So then somebody could come in and go edit the things by hand. But we'll just have to see. I don't know. I'm going to jump ships a little bit, but I was going to say Visual Studio, has this awesome tooling for publishing a .NET app using GitHub Actions. And the tooling is actually really simple. We just generate an action file. That's not that big of a deal. But I love the fact that we actually go out to the app service, when we pull down the publish profile, we stick it automatically into the GitHub secrets for you. That's where the tools are magic is. I've done all those things manually, and it's like user secrets would be the same kind of thing. Any stuff like that we can go, you're aware of this. If we don't do that kind of stuff, people will go do the wrong things and put the secrets in the wrong places, and then bad things will happen. So definitely an area we'll look into.
I think that's it. It's quite interesting you mentioned GitHub Actions, because my next question was actually going to be around GitHub versus Azure DevOps. Because they obviously do very similar things. They both do CI/CD. They both store Git repositories, source code. They both got a concept of issue tracking, like with Azure Boards versus GitHub Issues. Is Microsoft going to continue? Because obviously you're putting more and more stuff into GitHub now, because obviously Microsoft bought it out, and we're seeing a lot of cool tooling, as you've just described, around GitHub. Is Microsoft still going to ongoingly support Azure DevOps? What's the roadmap for Azure DevOps?
Azure DevOps is not going away by any means. In fact, the product we talked about a lot on this podcast, .NET, is built with Azure DevOps. So I'll just throw out my favorite way of describing this is we've had more than one customer come to us and say, hey, we just moved to Azure DevOps. We don't move this kind of infrastructure around very often. And so I don't think anybody has to worry about Azure DevOps going anywhere anytime soon. And as I said, Visual Studio and .NET and all the tech that we are talking about on the podcast is all built with, the Azure DevOps stuff. So I don't think there's any worries there at all. Interestingly enough, both GitHub and Azure DevOps just moved to DevDiv, the area where Garv and I work now too. So it really feels like we have all the developer bits in one single place, whether it's the languages and frameworks, the tools, the services in the cloud, and the actual places that you put your work items and your source code. All being in the same place is going to give us some amazing synergy. I can't wait to see what we come up with.
I've just realised it's 8 o'clock, and I know you two both have a hard stop. But before we wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out to you both if they have any questions?
To me, I'm on Twitter as @CoolCSH. That is COOLCSH. That might sound weird, but it's because every form of Scott Hunter was already taken, and CSH are my initials, Carl Scott Hunter. And so it's cool. Carl Scott Hunter is basically my Twitter handle. It's a great way to reach me. Happy to answer any questions there.
Yeah, and for me as well, like my Twitter handle is at Gaurav Seth, GAURAVSETH. Find me there, and I'm happy to, more than happy to connect with y'all.
Awesome, fantastic. So it just leaves a big, massive thank you to you both for joining me on the show. I know that, as I said before, that you both must be so busy with the lead up to Build, and so I so greatly appreciate you spending the time to join me on the show. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dan. It was wonderful chatting with you. I think it was really great. Thank you for the roller coaster. Didn't even realize when the time went away.
A lot of time went away. I was going to say thanks for having us as well, and hopefully we do it next year for next year's Build.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds good. I'll hold you on that one.
Yes, thank you. Have a good one.
And a big thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag #unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Dracan, which is DRACAN, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And we will include links to all the things we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.